Thanks, Sue, and thanks for having me today to talk about our recent experience in admitting failure and talking about it openly with a donor. And I know that this is quite a bit of interest to a number of UN organizations because we hear this over and over again that while sometimes ambitions for collaboration or talking about failure or other pieces of a project can be high, when it comes to dealing with traditional donors, it can be difficult to have those ambitions turned into reality. So if we could just go to the first slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a report that was sent just this summer to our primary funder about the experiences of failure that we had within the first year and a half of the SDG lab and what we call the Geneva 2030 ecosystem. And really where this stemmed from was we are constantly preaching here in Geneva and beyond that the 2030 agenda is about transformative change. And in order to have transformative change, we have to change the way we work and also our mindsets. And one of the pieces of mindset shifting that we talk about is embracing failure. And we decided quite deliberately that if we're going to talk about that with the community and promote it, we also need to walk the talk and have that implemented within our own organizations. Can you just go to the next slide, please? Thanks. So I prepared the failure report, and I'll go into what's included in that for our funder. And as soon as I presented it to my superior, the first thing that came back to me was saying, you know, failure is a bit of a strong word. Maybe instead, we should absolutely talk about what we've done wrong, but maybe instead of calling it the failure report, we should call it the lessons learned report. And after a lot of discussion with my boss, we decided that if we're not able to take those steps and call failure what it is, then it's going to be very difficult for others. And it's also not going to send the message we want that it's only truly a failure if you don't learn from it, and that it's okay to label things that didn't work in such a way. And so we, I think somewhat bravely did call it a failure report and sent it forward. But I think it's also important to note that this came after a very open relationship with our donor. So I know in many other situations, this won't always be as straightforward, but for us, we had a very open, transparent, and ongoing dialogue with our donor about the project. So nothing was a huge surprise. And I think Chris also alluded to the fact that none of the failures that we put forward and none of the failures we've had so far are kind of, reputation breaking or resulted in millions of dollars lost. So I also want to acknowledge and recognize that this can be more challenging depending on the type of failure and why it happened. But it also is a paradigm shift to start to recognize that in order to become better development professionals or professionals in peace or humanitarian contexts, we do need to label what didn't work, learn from that, and move forward. So next slide just goes over a little bit of how we built the failure report and what we put in it. So the first thing that we did was we framed the failure. So again, this comes down to not just jumping in the deep end, but rather focusing on framing failure as a way to do better work and explaining that if we were to keep these things kind of hidden, it wouldn't allow for any lessons within our community and within the donors community. And therefore, we felt it was important to share. So we did put some kind of upfront framing. We then, I think I identified 5 different failures that we had. And I probably could have done more, and I think I will in the future. But what essentially we did is just made a chart that said failure and then what we learned. So when explaining the failure, one of the things that we found in the literature that seemed very important was explaining why it was a failure. So not just saying this didn't work, but doing a little bit of a postmortem on why exactly it didn't work and what were the contributing factors. And so I'll give you an example. We host what we call an ecosystem group, and this group meets approximately every 4 to 6 months in Geneva to talk about how together we can better collaborate and innovate and advance the SDGs together. And at the beginning, these meetings were very highly attended, over 100 people coming, usually, you know, percentage-wise, about 40 to 60% of the people we invited were showing up. And when I started looking at the numbers for our a meeting that we had in November last year, we had 15% attendance rate and about 30 people show up. So I of course noted that failure, but then I started to look a little bit deeper. Yes, we had it on a busy week. It was big conferences happening in Geneva, but there's always big conferences happening in Geneva. And so I can't blame it on the time or the venue. So what was it that was different? And what we realized is that the nature of the ecosystem had changed. At the beginning, we were doing a lot of work in establishing what the ecosystem needed and asking them to give us input on how we could support them. And we'd make that very clear in the agendas and pre-meeting material that we sent out. And what we realized is we had less of those types of questions at this particular event and more updates and kind of procedural information. And so we explained in the failure report that the ecosystem had grown to such a size and in such a way that we had not responded to that and changed our approach in how we attracted those people and made it valuable to utilize their time. So we explain that as our why, and then to explain how our approach has changed, we explained that in the future we would be very clear in having value to the community. So for example, in the next one, we hosted more of an open space session where people could bring forward their challenges and get input from the community. And again, we were back up to our normal numbers. So it's only, again, a failure if we don't learn from it, a true failure if we don't learn from it. But unless we're able to identify those things that didn't work and bring them forward, it's very hard to have those lessons. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, the one, yes, here. So I did look into the literature quite a bit into what makes a good failure report. And one thing that I think is important to note is that this was based on my perceptions of what didn't work, and I have not ground truth to that. So in future, and to make it, I think, a more robust report and a little bit more grounded in the needs of the community, would certainly utilize more data, hopefully in the form of surveys, and also have interviews with stakeholders about what didn't work. And this is something that I didn't have time or the resources at the time when we decided to try this out. But I will be doing in the next iteration of the report. So this is something that I found over and over in the literature, that it's important to share stories and talk to people who were actually affected and get a sense of why it didn't work for them. The next slide is just, again, focused on the open dialogue and how you frame conversations with funders. I mean, our funder is a development agency, and therefore we have the very traditional contract and log frame and those, you know, very kind of specific accountability mechanisms. But we also, as I mentioned, have a good relationship with a lot of transparency with them. So we've established that from the beginning, and we treated this as a way to add to the open dialogue and be self-aware and agile as we move forward. And then the final slide, I just included a few resources that I happen to like a lot. One of my favorite organizations in this space is called Fail Forward, and they have a whole resources page, including how to write a failure report. That's quite a simple framework, but I think it can be quite powerful in having those discussions. And then TED actually has a whole section on failure, and one of my favorite talks is in a very similar development context, but from Engineers Without Borders, who were some of the pioneers in failure reporting. So I recommend checking out that talk. And I think that will be sent around in the post-meeting email. So that's my experience, and thanks so much. If anyone has questions, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to answer any questions.